Hello, Anika. Weeks and weeks ago I promised to give you a lesson on how to make pie. So today I'm going to film it and Graham will upload it for you, and hopefully this week you can make some pie for your family. Now, when you're cooking, there are three things you need to do to begin. You need to tie up your hair with a ponytail or a clip. It is a good idea, if you have one, to put on an apron. I'm just going to get mine. And you need to wash your hands with soap and water for 30 seconds. So Graham, if you could just pause while I wash my hands, please. Camera running? Okay. So, nice clean hands. Please don't skip that step. If you want to cook with your hair down and run the risk of a hair in your food, that's not great, and you can cook without an apron, but you have to wash your hands. Now, in order to make pie, you have to make pastry. In order to make pastry, you need 4 ingredients. You need a fat. I'm going to use Crisco. You can use a lard, like tender flake, or butter if you wish. Margarine will work. Butter and margarine, if you use them, will tend to burn. So I would go with Crisco or with lard. You're also going to need flour. I'd use white flour to begin. You're going to need a bit of salt. You're also going to need some ice water. You can cool it with ice, or you can put it in the fridge for a little while before you begin. Now, begin by measuring out 2 cups of flour into a very open, shallow metal bowl, if you have one. You'll see in a couple of minutes why it's a good idea to have one that's fairly wide and shallow, rather than deep and narrow. Now, there's 2 cups of flour. Next, we need a teaspoon of salt. And you really shouldn't do what I did, which is measure over the bowl, because you can have it all fall in. Okay, there. Let me show you how to measure the salt correctly. Take it and measure it like this, leveling it off at the end. Okay? Now, put that down the sink. The next thing you do with your fingers or with a fork is blend the salt and flour together. Now, we're going to do a process called cutting in the fat. To cut in the fat, you need to measure out 3/4 of a cup of Crisco. Now, Crisco generally comes in a nice block like this. And in the box on the edge, you'll see that there are some measuring markings. We need to cut 3/4 of a cup of fat and use that in our pastry. So, peel back the paper carefully. Open it out. Level off the end by taking off that bit. With the edge, measure out 3/4 of a cup. Draw a line, cut down, and lift it off. With the knife, cut small rectangles or squares of the fat to get it started. Now, put this away, out of the way. Okay, now, the 3/4 of a cup of fat is in the flour. Toss it around gently. The process of cutting in is the process of rubbing or cutting the fat so that it blends in with the flour into small pieces about the size of a small pea. You see how I'm using my fingers? I'm not mushing it into a ball like a snowball. I'm rubbing the fat with my thumbs and fingers so that it gets mushed in with the flour and broken up. The Crisco should be cool but soft and fairly easy to work with. You don't want to be really rubbing too hard. You see how I'm being fairly gentle about how I do this? You don't want to overdo it, because if you do, the fat and the flour will overblend, and then you won't be able to get your pastry to work. So just keep lightly raising it up. Now, there's another way of doing this using a tool called a pastry cutter. I don't actually own a pastry cutter because I prefer to use my fingers. But if you go to a hardware store, you can get a pastry cutter. It's a kind of oval shaped, there's a handle and then usually 4 or 5 wires in an oval shape, and you use it to go like this and to cut the Crisco in so that you don't have to touch it with your fingers and get all mucky like I'm getting. It's advantageous to use one, well, if you don't enjoy the feel of the pastry. I don't mind that, so it doesn't bother me. If you tend to have very warm hands, it might be advantageous to use a pastry cutter, because if your hands are exceedingly warm, it'll start to melt the fat and will make your pastry tough. Now, notice here, I'm going to tilt this up so it's easier to see. Notice how crumbly this is. And it's got a quality to it a little bit like thick sand. There are a few larger pieces of Crisco blended in. Most of it is fairly small. Now, if I kept working this, if I overworked it, it would start to gum up into a ball, and you don't want that. If you find the first time you do this that you overwork it and it starts to form a ball without water, then throw it all away. Crisco and flour cost people 75 cents, and it's a big waste of time past a certain point. Now, once it's ready, as it is now, what I do is I take the pastry and I kind of push it so that it creates kind of a bowl inside of a bowl, like that. And then I'm going to begin with 4 tablespoons of chilled ice water. 1, and I'm going to dribble it around down the sides. 2. Okay, that was a mistake. I think I'm probably going to wind up with closer to 5 tablespoons of water, but that's okay. Now, this does get a little mucky at this point, so you might want to consider getting a fork. And using the fork, gently take the ball, mush flour and the water together, and you'll see that it starts to solidify into a ball. Take it and gently work it so that it begins to become a nice, soft ball of dough. Okay? Now, I'm not being rough with it. Always be gentle with your pastry or it'll be tough. Now, the pastry is in a rather rough and crumbly state at this point, and I'm going to make it into a disc with my hands. Your hands are smaller than mine. You might have a hard time with this, but just keep working at it. This disc of dough should be enough for a small pie. Now, we're not making a pie today. We're making cinnamon twists. The cinnamon twists, I'm just going to put that there for a second and clean off my hands. Clean up this bit of water. So, let's start here. Now, I want to take some flour and spread it around. Okay. This is a fairly large ball of dough, so I'm going to cut it in half, set half aside. Take this and make it into a ball again. You want it to be in a bit of a disc, like that. Now, a trick my grandmother showed me was to take it and pinch it around the edges. This will help to keep it from cracking when you're rolling it into a larger circle. Take a rolling pin, put some flour on the rolling pin, and then, again, gently, notice I'm using that word a lot, begin to center the rolling pin and roll it from the center out. Squishing it gently, pressing it. If it starts to stick, put a little more flour on. Little by little, it's coming into a kind of a circle. Now you can see this side's working out really nicely. This side's cracking a little. And I don't really want it to crack, because if I was actually making a pie, that would be a problem. So I'm going to press it in a little bit. Lift it up and move it around so that it doesn't stick. And continue. Always go from the center out, working your way around 360 degrees, pressing gently. Now, for these cinnamon twists that we're going to make, there. Now, what we can do with this is just press it in like that. Now, all right, I'm going to leave that for a moment. I'm going to show you something that you need to prepare so that you can bake it. Oh, a couple things. One, you need your oven on 425, and I forgot to turn mine on, so I'm going to do that quickly now. 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Second, because these cinnamon twists are going to have sugar and cinnamon melting out of them, and they're going to be very sticky, we're going to use a product called parchment paper to protect the pan. We're not going to grease it, because if you grease the pan, then the pie will become greasy and unpleasant. Okay, there's enough fat in there already, it doesn't need any more. But if you don't protect the pan in some way, the brown sugar and cinnamon are going to melt out over the pan, they're going to caramelize and stick, and you can basically kiss your pan goodbye because you will never get it off. All right? Parchment paper. You want to use this. Take the time to go out and buy some if you don't have it. Now, a couple things. One, do not use wax paper instead. Wax paper has a coating on it that will catch on fire potentially if you put it in the oven. That's a very bad thing. If you don't have parchment paper and you really don't want to go and get parchment paper, my suggestion is that you wrap your pan in tin foil. I don't know if that's going to work, but I know that it's better than ruining your pan. However, I really think you should get the parchment paper. It's a great product. Go for it. Now, for the cinnamon twists, we are going to take a spoon, just an ordinary tablespoon, and some softened butter, and we're going to spread it on. Don't go all the way to the edge, please, because if you do, that'll be a problem. But you want to go fairly close to the edge. Okay, like that. I don't know how much I use there. I would say probably about 3 to 4 tablespoons of margarine. You don't have to be super exact about this. Although I would recommend that you not get too carried away with the butter, because otherwise you're basically going to deep fry your cinnamon twists and they're not going to be all that great. Next, you want some brown sugar. And if you want to measure, then I would suggest that you use about 1/3 of a cup. Can't find my 1/3 of a cup. Okay. So you want to basically just cover this with brown sugar. And I think that you're going to need 1/3 to 1/2 a cup of sugar. Spread it around with your fingers. Don't get too carried away. A little is enough. Okay. So, there we go. Last, you're going to sprinkle some cinnamon on. I would say you're probably using between 1/2 and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon there. Okay, so you're going to take this and you're going to roll it. Pastry has a tendency to be a bit crumbly, so just work it gently. If you have to, get a knife and loosen it. You want it to be reasonably tight, not too loose. And what you have is some little a roll there. I wouldn't use that, and I would just throw that away. Cut them into about 1-inch slices. Like that. And then lay them out like this. Okay. This is how my grandmother used to use up leftover pastry when she was making pies. Cinnamon and brown sugar taste great for this. Another alternative, though, is to use jam. So we'll roll out the other half and we'll make some jam twists. You'll see how that's done. It's pretty similar. Roll out the pastry. Starts to stick. Lots of flour. Something that can happen at this point is that you can start to get little bits of pastry sticking. If that's happening, they'll make dents in the pastry and they'll tend to stick to the pastry and be a problem. So if your rolling pin is getting lumpy, take a moment to scrape it off. Now, we'll just quickly roll this out. I'll spread some jam on it. And let's see how that goes. Now sometimes, actually, now that I come to think about it, you've seen how to make a twist. If you were going to make jam twists, if that happens, if it tears like that, just mush it up like that, and then roll it again to flat like that. There you go. Now, if you were going to make jam twists, you would just spread jam on here, roll it up, cut them exactly the way you did with the cinnamon twists. But sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want something a little bit fancier. So you can take a cutter, like a biscuit cutter, cut yourself some little circles, and fill those circles with jam. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, I've got some blackcurrant jam here, and oh goodness, I can't get this over my hand, I'm too slippery. Oh, there we go. Now, what we're going to do here, we're going to lift this away. And pull this back. All right. take a spoon, put a little dollop of jam into 5 of these. Don't use tons, please, because otherwise it will goop out all over the place. That one, for instance, is a little bit carried away. So I'm going to just lift some of that off. Put it on this one. Now, these are rather small circles, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to lift this over top and put it down like that. If you have bigger circles, you could fold them in half and make like a turnover. But these are so tiny that I think that they would leak out. So I'm just going to go like this. I'm going to pinch them down on the sides, and then we'll bake those like that. If they're not sticking very nicely, you can just use a little fork. A little fiddly to work with, but it's fine. Take your time. Put it down, give them one little poke with a fork to make sure that they don't explode on you. And you're good to go. A couple little holes. Now, if you want to, you could pinch them instead like this. That also works. You're making little saucers, which are nice to drink with a cup of tea. Okay. Now these are going to cook pretty quickly. I would suggest that you put them in for about 10 minutes. See how they're doing. They might need a little longer, we'll see, but better to cook for a shorter time than to have them in for a longer time and have them burn. Now, I have a little bit of extra dough here. I would like to get this in the oven and get going with the next project, so I'm going to set this aside. But you could re-roll this, just make it into a ball, re-roll it, and make some more twists or jam tarts. Okay? So, these are in the oven for 10 minutes. And we'll pause it, and you'll see them come out of the oven in a few minutes.